When you look at the list of core actions available for SharePoint workflows, you'll find one action called Set Workflow Variable. Set Workflow Variable is used to create a memory space that you can use to hang on to an item that you want to use later in the workflow. For example, you might get some information from a user that you want to use 3 steps along. So we'll store that in a workflow variable. You might calculate something, and after it's calculated but before it's used somewhere, it's going to be stored in a workflow variable. There are a couple of different ways to create workflow variables. One is using Set Workflow Variable, and when you do that, you'll actually go up in this workflow and click on Local Variables and add a named container for it. So if you were going to calculate a total cost, we might just call it total cost, and we'd want to store that sort of thing as an integer or a number, not as a string, and you'd say OK, and we'd have a new workflow local variable that we could use. You can come back and modify the variable if you need to, if you forgot to type it correctly, for example, and you use string when you meant to have number, or you used number when you intended to have Boolean. So these are modifiable, and they're also removable when you don't need them in a workflow any longer. However, Set Workflow Variable is only one of a number of actions that use workflow variables. And when you use the other actions, you have a choice either to assign something to a variable that you created as a local variable, or to simply allow SharePoint to make up its own names for the variables as it goes along. Let's take a look at the list of actions that use workflow variables. The first, of course, is Set Workflow Variable, where you very intentionally have said, I have a purpose, I want to do a calculation and store it somewhere. I want to grab some information from my user and store it somewhere. But if you create a new list item, SharePoint will actually create fields to store the items in until it can create the new item. If you do a calculation, the results have to be stored somewhere, if only for a microsecond. And the same thing with time-date calculations, which add time to date and set time portion are both types of. When you collect data from a user, it needs to go somewhere. And then finally, all of the utility actions create workflow variables, from extracting a substring to finding an interval between 2 dates. Notice that they all are functions, and every one of them needs a place to store its results. So workflow variables allow you to store the contents of information temporarily without needing to provide a SharePoint column or a form field to store it in.